Welcome to Arts First, the show that stands for freedom of expression in the arts and art for art's sake. I'm Niall Crowley, and with me, of course, is my co-host, Wendy Earle. We hope you're enjoying our output so far this year, and we've lots more to come. Today, we're talking about heritage in the form of national historic buildings and houses, their importance to our national story, their artistic and cultural significance, what we do with them, how we care for them. So you may be aware of, over the last couple of years or so, of a growing controversy about and around one of our main national organisations charged with caring for many of our most important buildings and spaces. I'm talking, of course, about the National Trust, which, according to pressure group Restore Trust, has become a lightning rod for criticism over its attempts to decolonise its properties, foster social justice activism, and for placing historic links with the slave trade at the forefront of its conservation work. Defenders of the National Trust come in some interesting forms. Restore Trust, according to Stuart Lee in The Guardian, where else, is a fake grassroots group running an insidious campaign made up of nationalist evangelical Christians and suffering from an illness called nostalgia. Even our PM, Sir Keir Starmer, has waded in defence of the National Trust, of course. He doesn't mention the Trust critics by name, except for the Tories, but he says that instead of working with the National Trust so more people can learn about and celebrate our culture and our history, they've managed to demean their work. Well, so Wendy and I, following this debate over the last couple of years, if you could call it that, it seemed like there were some interesting questions to be had and some, hopefully, a debate to be had. But from the defenders of the National Trust, it's been very hard to find anything of genuine substance or any attempt to really engage in arguments from them, which I think we found enormously frustrating. So as much as we would love to have Stuart Lee or Sir Keir Starmer or even Hilary McGrady, the Director General of the National Trust, to discuss their ideas on architectural heritage, in the absence of that, we've managed to bag ourselves three far more important and interesting guests. Cornelia van der Pol is a co-founder and the current chair of the above-mentioned Restore Trust. Calvin Poe is a critic and lecturer on architecture. He writes widely and brilliantly on architecture for journals like The Critic and The Spectator. Dr. Alka Segal Cuthbert is an educator, academic, and author. She's a director of Don't Divide Us, which describes itself as the UK's common sense voice on race. And she stood as a candidate for the National Trust Council last year, and she's a founding supporter of Arts First. Can we kick off with like a general question? So if maybe you could briefly set out how you or what you see as the threat to our heritage today, how you see the problem, why it was and what you've been doing, why it was that you decided to take a stand, if you like. Cornelia, welcome. What do you think?
Thank you very much. Yes, well, I can tell you when we decided to take a stand, which was in late 2020, when the Times leaked a report, an internal report from the National Trust, the so-called Mansion Report, which was their 10-year strategy and which talked about things like repurposing historic houses and talked about the outdated mansion experience and said essentially that in the future people are going to stop visiting historic houses in large numbers. We're stuck with all these houses. What are we going to do with them? We should be putting furniture in storage and creating flexible spaces for fun experiences. That was the tenor of the report. And several of us were absolutely horrified at this wholesale abdication of responsibility. You know, what it told us was the National Trust had simply lost confidence in what it was doing, looking after historic houses. And then subsequently, the Slavery and Colonialism report came out, and that was pretty shocking because the claim was, oh, well, we're telling the whole truth, we're telling the stories in full. But actually, it was more a matter of a rather skewed um, and selective telling of the history associated with the properties. And you could see, for example, in the way that historical figures like Churchill and Curzon were treated, firstly with mistakes. So it showed that the people writing the report didn't really know their terrain. And secondly, extremely selectively. Focusing entirely on the supposed bad things they did and saying none of the good things they did. And then lots followed from that. We started looking into how they treated volunteers. A lot of curators were made redundant during the COVID period. We started looking into countryside management. So a lot of stuff flowed from that.
Thank you. That's a really good start. Quite a shocking array, really, isn't it? Calvin, do you want to give us your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe we can indulge in a little bit of identity politics, actually, because for the listeners who can't see, I'm obviously ethnic minority. My grandparents were Chinese refugees who fled to Hong Kong during the Japanese invasion in the Second World War. And I grew up in Hong Kong, which arguably was the last significant outpost of the British Empire. I'm sure the Chagossians will also have something to say about that. And the handover happened in my lifetime. But I live here now in London as an immigrant. And so I chose to be in this country. I voted with my feet, you could say. And I feel very strongly about architectural heritage and cultural heritage is because I think it's what makes this country so beautiful. It defines the soul of this country, and it really breaks my heart when I see the National Trust willfully kind of undermining and destroying and not stewarding the kind of our cultural inheritance. And I think it's even more insulting that they kind of pander to a caricature of what they think an ethnic minority immigrant might want to hear when visiting a country house. And I would very much prefer if the National Trust actually bothered to ask me what I want instead of concocting a stereotype of what a oppressed minority in this country might want. So that's kind of why I feel very strongly about it. And I think the saddest thing is that the stewardship of our heritage is not a one-off act. It's a continuous relay race from every generation to pass on to the next. So that's what offends me the most, is that, if we mess it up in this generation, how are we going to answer for our children and our children's children? So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Right, thank you. Alka?
Okay, thank you. Well, as another ethnic minority, Calvin, you're not alone. And I can reassure Arts First that you're thoroughly representative in your diversity quota here, because there's 2 of us out of 5. But more seriously, I think I really agree with the points you were making, Calvin, about the beauty of British heritage more broadly, but particularly the country houses. And I think that there's such a very, very frustrating and annoying lack of imagination on the part of the National Trust to actually look at what they have and make something really exciting out of it, instead of which they look for the excitement outside. So they look to minorities or relevance or children or, basically anything that they think will be relevant and exciting, rather than look at actually what's right there in front of them. And I think there's several different reasons for that. But just to your question, Noel, how I came to it, it wasn't the National Trust came to be my concern more latterly. My original concern was for the break in transmission that you alluded to, Calvin, but because I was a teacher for many years and I could see, was working in a context where there was a very intentional striving and policy to adopt a much more sociological approach to things that were actually cultural and aesthetic.
So, why is heritage so important and worth defending? Is it particularly worth defending today? Is it particularly important?
It's hugely important, because without a historical and without a moral imagination, we really are stuck in the present. And if you're stuck in the present, kind of emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, and more broader in social psychology, if you like, and the norms, then then you're really hamstrung. You're kind of operating with amputated limbs. You haven't got that support. So it really truncates your whole view of what is, and your view of what could be in the future just shrinks. And I think that's very much the period that we're living in.
Do you think there's like a more of a modern idea of heritage, though? I'm thinking back to the formation of was it formed in the 80s or the early 90s under the Tories, the Department of Heritage? Obviously, the National Trust and English Heritage have been around a very long time, but did it become more of a politicized thing? And then I remember where, as soon as Labour came in, it became the Department of Culture. So would you say that it's always been a kind of a politicized area, if you like? Is there something very specific going on at the moment with the kind of things that I described in the introduction that you've been talking about, Cornelia, for example?
Well, of course, the National Trust was founded in 1895, and one of the reasons it was founded apparently was to provide an opportunity for urban people to escape to the countryside and to beautiful places. And then alongside that, a powerful motivation for the National Trust's work was to stop and prevent industrial and urban sprawl. In the 1930s, there was a book by Clough Williams Ellis called England and the Octopus. The idea that suburban sprawl and more railways and more factories and more campsites and so on was like an octopus spreading its tentacles through our countryside. Now, I suppose there's always been a sort of social political dimension to this to an extent. And nowadays, people in the National Trust, people who defend the National Trust, its approach to countryside rewilding, climate change, lobbying government in particular, those people would now argue, oh, well, it's always been political and we've always been of a socialist bent. And so we're carrying on this tradition.
Maybe I can also add to the politicization of heritage. For me, I probably come from a different angle. What makes me feel so strongly about this is almost having seen it done the wrong way or seen it go wrong. Obviously, growing up in the kind of Chinese-speaking world, we're very aware of the history of the Cultural Revolution, where there's kind of very tumultuous period in China's history where they actively kind of very radically politicized people actively targeted culture as a way of remolding the identity of the nation. And there was a very kind of intentional campaign to purge or undermine what they referred to as the four olds. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it includes old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits. And for me, having moved to the UK in the 21st century, I see a lot of very uncomfortable parallels, whether it's academics being denounced and cancelled for purporting certain kind of views that are deemed not in chiming with the current prevailing consensus, or certain kind of cultural artifacts being denigrated or removed from view, as you can see in the National Trust. I remember visiting is it Sudbury Hall, where they have paintings of the ancestral family with these trite and quite derogatory speech bubbles underneath the paintings. To even like the active wanton destruction of the built heritage, like we're seeing with the proposed plans at Clarendon Park. So I don't think it is too much of a stretch to actually compare the two, because I feel like deep down they're driven by the same instinct that somehow the past is something to be embarrassed of, and it's holding us it's an inconvenient obstacle to get rid of before we can achieve this utopian, egalitarian kind of world. So I think having seen how badly that ended up makes me feel a lot stronger about why we should not go down the same path. And it's worth noting that even China today, they've thankfully left that kind of cultural attitude behind them and actively seek to plug themselves into this lineage of history and heritage. They like to make a big point about 5,000 years of civilization, because they realize heritage and history is part of what also gives a society its legitimacy. And I think if we kind of hollow ourselves out from underneath, I think that we end up in a really dangerous situation where this just becomes like a floating platform for the global citizen.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful way of actually showing that there's something different going on today. I think that's what I was really trying to get at. Alka, and then Wendy, did you want to say something?
Just a couple of things I just want to put in there in this particular context of the question you've asked. A social attitude survey in Britain from 2024 showed that there's been a decline in pride in British history from 86% in 2013 to 64% in 2024. Now, obviously, you can't, I don't know how long these surveys have been going on for, but they wouldn't have gone back to the 17th century or the 18th century. But that's still a very significant thing, I think, that the public, there's a kind of loss of a public historical sense of history. I think when you're talking about a political government so intentionally setting up a Ministry of Culture, it's a sure sign that you've lost a nation, a society has lost an organic or spontaneous way of producing and reproducing culture when you have to have, a government committee doing it. And the other thing which I think this is probably the most salient thing, was Neil McGregor, who I really like in a lot of ways, on Radio 4's programme, The Grand House, Boom or Bust. He said, he gave probably the most cogent reason for reinvention that I've heard. I think he's wrong, but it was the most cogent reason. He said that, these grand houses once belonged to individual families, and the histories around them were the histories of those individual families. But now they're public property. They're no longer many of the, most of them a lot of them have been sold off to the National Trust. And so therefore the histories need to tell a new history because they're no longer those of individual families. So we need a broader narrative. He didn't use the word decolonizing or inclusive. I think he was very careful not to couch it in those sort of crass culture war terms. But to me, it indicated, again, really what I think probably even more than political activism is, for me, the biggest problem is the real shrinkage of imagination. There are such rich stories to tell, and Kedleston House up in Derbyshire, where you look there, and the information is there in the booklet about how it was built. And by the way, reinvention is not a new thing, because Kedleston House itself was demolished in 1758 by one of the family. The Curzons had been there from way back to the 12th century. But in 1758, Nathaniel Curzon, who was a man of the Renaissance and had done the Grand Tour and everything, came back, and when he inherited it, he smashed it all down, right? And rebuilt it, and rebuilt all the villages and the roads around it. So the idea of reinvention isn't new, but obviously it's what are you reinventing? What is that reinvention giving rise to? And the reinventing that we're seeing today is, in my view, giving rise to shoddier, imaginatively impoverished, ugly, aesthetically ugly art. Now that's sweeping, and I'm sure there will be individual cases that will not be like that, but I think that is the majority trend. Whereas reinvention in the 18th century gave us Kedleston Hall and Capability Brown Gardens around it, gorgeous.
Yeah, and I think the difference there is that in the 1760s you had a civilization that had real confidence in itself, not morally perfect, not with the angels, but a civilization that knew where it was going. Yeah. And in came this wonderful Adams style in which Kedleston Hall was rebuilt. And now it's as if we've entered this national cringe. I don't know if this happens in the Chinese-speaking world at all, Calvin, but certainly we are cringing at our past, unwilling to say a good word about our past heroes for fear of sounding gauche. And at the same time, you have, Calvin mentioned Clarendon Park, of course, which burnt down coming on for 11 years ago.
Under the National Trust care,
yes. And I think it's fair to mention that the cause of the fire was entirely preventable. It was an electric fire. And the National Trust is refusing to reinstate the fine rooms for which the house was famous, and instead wants to create quite an appalling scheme of a conserved ruin with some rather weird and unsympathetic interventions. And then you also mentioned Sudbury Hall, which in an effort to make it relevant, as the National Trust has transformed it into what they call the children's country house, hence the speech bubbles, make it fun for children. And then the other house that I would like to mention here is Benningborough Hall in Yorkshire, where in 2019 they sent back a long-term loan of dozens of pictures from the National Portrait Gallery. And to the best of my knowledge, I asked the Portrait Gallery whose idea was this, and they seemed to imply it wasn't their idea, it was the National Trust that wanted to do this. So the portraits went back. I've now seen 2 of them on display in the new hang at the Portrait Gallery, but all the others would appear to be in storage now. And the house is looking very bleak. It's being used for rolling exhibitions of contemporary art, but this is just nothing like the world-class collection that was then. And it's not just the paintings. There was a lot of extremely fine furniture, which I suppose must be in storage because it's still in the Benningborough Hall collection. And there were ceramics from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford too.
Can I just say something? It's just coming back to the point that Niall started with about heritage and nostalgia, because I think what we're talking about has a very long history. So it's not really just, since New Labour. The whole idea of heritage was brought up by Tories before that and was very politicised, and so in a way, there's a sort of has been a long period of time over the last, say, 40, 50 years, more or less, where the idea of history has been a little bit of a political football. I mean, it's interesting, I think, to think about how nostalgia has become such an insult. You insult somebody if you tell them that they're being nostalgic. That's supposed to the end kind of argument about what the past represents. I think one of the problems we have is in a way that both right and left, if you like, both sides of the political debate have, in a way, not seen history as an important part of who we are, but as something, I think what Kelvin was saying earlier, about something that has to be changed or pushed away from. So I'd be quite interested to think about how do we push back against that, on the one hand, on the politicization of history, because the problem is once it's politicized, it's actually quite hard to unpoliticize. It becomes a left-right issue. But also, how do we sort of build up a sense of defending it for its own sake? Because it's not necessarily even just about identity. Actually, it's about something that's very beautiful. And we need to sort of think about what the arguments are that we're making for the past, for the National Trust houses. So like something like Clarendon Park. I mean, I used to go there when I was a young teenager, I think. And I just loved going and looking around and seeing these wonderful pieces from the past. But I didn't see them as particularly relevant to the present. I just enjoyed seeing them. So do we need to sort of push back against that discussion about relevance and nostalgia and all these words that are being used to defend what National Trust might be doing at the moment, and other history organisations, I imagine, too?
I think the point you make about beauty is very important, actually, because in a way, if you think of 3 cardinal virtues, beauty, truth, and goodness, it's beauty that you see first. Your introduction to anything beautiful can then prompt other questions to do with, is it good, is it true, how do we know, etc., the more epistemological questions. But it's that first aesthetic encounter, I think, that is really important. And I think we have to just be very assertive in saying, this is not beautiful, this is beautiful. This is not true. You're not being truthful. I think we can be confident that actually most of the public are with us on this. I don't know if any of you saw the National Gallery a while ago. They had a pavilion just outside of it. So you had the plinths, you had that horrible 4th plinth, And then right next to it, you have this pavilion with the public's favourite paintings, and they were all great, beautiful art, right? So the public gets it. It's just the elites that don't. So and sure, there'll be some people who will enter an argument or a discussion with you, but more often than not, you don't even. It's just like saying no. It's ugly. This is beautiful. Look.
Maybe I'd like to build onto that and also address, Wendy, your kind of prompt about perhaps how do we fix this? So as someone who teaches at an architecture school, I think the way we kind of undo a lot of these issues is also starting with education. And I think my personal theory is that these kind of attitudes did start in the educational or academic sphere, and that's how they kind of gradually trickle down from the elite downwards, maybe not so as successfully as they might have hoped. But I'm just recalling my time as an architectural student in this country. So I went to the University College London, which, well, then regarded itself as probably the most elite architecture school in this country. And I remember studying in my architectural history class, we did not look at the Greek or Roman or classical orders. We did not look at the influence of Islamic or Saracenic architecture. We did not look at medieval Gothic. What we studied mostly was Black feminist theory, critical theory. And I think there is this kind of intentional agenda to fixate on the politicization, fixate on the political in education. And now, when I deal with my own students, when they try to make design choices because they think one thing might be beautiful versus the other, they have to go through this intellectual gymnastics of justifying something through some kind of theoretical or conceptual or functionalist justification. And I think the idea that we can even design something because we think it's beautiful, this kind of instinct has been excised from our architectural education. Maybe we need to unlearn that instinct. And it really is like something that was introduced with the modernists, the idea that everything, the most kind of supreme expression of truth and beauty is something that's derived logically from the building's function. And I think when we look at a national trust property, a beautiful country house, the function is a container of meaning. And I think and it's not about how many square foot or what kind of rooms and the way they're connected to each other. They kind of contain the stories of the families and the generations that have gone past, the kind of histories of the various individuals who have shaped that country house over the generations. And I think there is a craving for that now. There are a lot of media outlets, podcasts and Instagram channels that fixate on the country house. People love those for what they are. They don't want a sanitized, politicized kind of finger-wagging interpretation of what those buildings represent, but they want to enjoy them for their full beauty. And I think we are in an opportune moment where the dial is shifting back towards that understanding of our heritage.
Something that has dismayed me about the National Trust recently is that they keep wanting to tell you how to feel, how to react. You must be overawed, you must be fascinated, you must play. And I so much agree with Alka and Calvin that we need to tell people it's okay just to go and enjoy the beauty, or whatever it is they want. Stop telling people what it is they've come for. Let them come and let them take from it what they want. And of course, it changes over a lifetime. When you're younger, certain things matter to you. When you're older, you get interested in other things. When you have children, again, are interested in other things. When the National Trust acquired properties, when James Lees Milne would go around the country in the 40s and look for houses to acquire, of course, he and people like him were really first and foremost interested in the architectural merits of a house. And so in as far as buildings are concerned, the National Trust was traditionally about architectural importance and beauty. And more recently, they've become more creative. So in the late 20th century, someone had the idea, why don't we open up the downstairs to the public and show them the kitchens? And people got really interested in that. And I mean, Victorian Georgian kitchens are extremely interesting and often very beautiful places. But then this morphed into what we see today, which is, oh, but it has to be relevant, it has to be new, it has to address all the current issues, whether visitors like it or not.
That it's interesting what you say, whether visitors like it or not, because listening to your contributions over the last few moments, the thing that strikes me is that there's an obvious disconnect between the people who are running National Trust and actually some of the galleries and museums we've been talking about on Arts First for the past few months, and where the public is. And it is actually quite inspiring, as Calvin says, to see that the public is genuinely interested in art and beauty and tradition and all kinds of things. It pops up on X and it pops up on Facebook, and so I'm fascinated by that. How do we get here with these institutions? In a way, they should be expressing that renewed interest, if you like, but are almost doing the opposite. And the way what you just described, Cornelia, reminds me a little bit of science communication, where everything is explained to you like you're a child. Isn't everything wonderful? That kind of Carl Sagan explaining the universe. And I think it's a little bit about taking the public seriously as well, isn't it? I guess moving towards the end, maybe we should talk about the institutions like the National Trust and how do we move things forward with them?
There's another organisation which is a bit like the National Trust, which is Historic Houses, formerly known as the Historic Houses Organisation, and that is a federation of independent historic houses, so houses that still have their families in them, but then this umbrella organisation. And what both their president and their director general have said in public recently is, when they surveyed young people, what they found was that young people want authentic experiences. So they want the atmosphere of the historic house. They don't want QR codes, they don't want screens, they don't want gimmicks. And I think what the members of historic houses do very well, of course, what's so beautiful about historic houses is there's real diversity, because every house is different and every family does it a bit differently. And some of them are more enterprising and more experimental, others are more conservative. There is this wonderful diversity of approach, but also authenticity that you find there.
One of the things I would say, I think it's good to know that there are people trying alternative things. One of was kind of shocked by the way the National Trust dismissed your efforts at criticism, because there was something very patronizing about, oh yes, we need to have conversations with people and then they'll understand what we want to do, as opposed to there's a valid criticism here that we need to think a bit harder about. And so there's almost like a developed within the institutions, and I think it's true of all of the cultural and arts institutions, the major ones like the Arts Council. At one level, they have no vision whatsoever. They're involved in one bureaucratic exercise after another, it seems. But at another level, there's a kind of seems to be an underlying instinct there to push the public away, or push the public that they don't really like, the more critical public, away, and to try and draw in the public who will kind of, in a way, conform to their expectations of what the public should be. And those expectations are very much driven by the DEI, the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda, I would suggest. It is very bizarre looking at them, because your criticisms do seem to be addressed. And, what happens to Clarendon House does matter, even if in the end, they're sort of like, even in the end, if they do something that's actually quite interesting, which, I'm not convinced that they will, but, even if they do interesting things, they should be open to the fact that there should be a debate about these issues, because the National Trust is very much a public organization, an organization for the public. And I think it's that attempt to push away the critical public that seems incredibly destructive of our culture and the way we identify with the world, these institutions that we live in. It's actually just self-destructive for them, but also it just is very worrying, because you feel like what could be preserved for the future is being destroyed because there's an agenda going on there that they don't really want to discuss.
It's not unintentional they're pushing away of the public because they do see us as, or rather they see themselves not as custodians of a heritage, but they see themselves as, coming back to the beginning really, it's agents of change, as agents of cultural and political change. So in a way, I think in terms of what we can do, will always be limited by what happens in the realm of politics. Because while we've got a deeply flawed and uninspiring political culture, people's efforts when they want to change things will be, I don't want to go there, but oh, hey, we can do it through education, we can do it through the curriculum, we can do it through art galleries. So, there will need to be a political push to rein politics in and to just cut the links between public bodies like the National Trust with universities, sociological departments. The only links between universities should be where they have courses and specialists in architecture, in painting, or in pottery, or whatever it is the offering is. Only with those specialists, and just cut the sociologists out of it, right? Because it's not their turf. They have no right to be there. They've only got their position there because of by default, really. So I think the pushback needs to be within the realms of education, certainly the cultural institutions, but also we know what our political class is like. They're going to need a kick up the backside to even be aware of the problem, never mind do anything about it.
Yeah, maybe I can also add on to that as well. I totally agree that we need to give them a kick up their backside. And I think there are multiple ways we can do that, as Cornelia mentioned, National Trust is a membership organization, and the fact that there are alternative membership organizations that steward historic homes, like historic houses, is a good kind of way of voting with your feet. There's a very successful case study of Wigmore Hall, for example, by refusing to take Arts Council money with all these kind of patronizing inclusivity strings attached to it. And they've actually managed to prove their point by saying we can do perfectly well without your box-ticking attitudes towards excellence. And actually now the government is finally coming towards their point of view to review that dreadful, I think it's called Let's Create scheme. And the government's own review of the Arts Council England approach to funding is now shifting because of that alternative that's proving what else is possible. But the sad thing is that the National Trust is, the premier heritage body in this country, and it has a lot of properties under its care and also probably more cash compared to other organizations. And I think the really important thing is to just get the National Trust to focus back to its basics, refocus on looking after the historic buildings and heritage in its care. And I think you can't really do that without making sure that there are also enough of the heritage skills like was mentioned earlier, that are in place. And I think you can't learn these heritage skills. I have plenty of friends in their 20s, young people who are interested in working on stained glass, working on stonemasonry, working on historic lime-based plastering. There is like a real resurgence of interested in traditional crafts. And you can't really learn those in a university lecture hall. You actually need buildings to work on and learn those skills on site. And when you have, a major property like Clarendon, and you're wasting that opportunity by having a modern roof and floor plates put into them rather than allowing it to be a test bed and site of learning for the traditional crafts, it's a real wasted opportunity. And then it's going to come back and bite the National Trust in its own backside 50 years down the line, and they need someone to do some specialist historic plaster work done, and there's no one with those skills anymore, and they've kind of died out, and with a body that of the size of the National Trust, they're really the only place that has the economies of scale to do that effectively. I don't know how much they are going to listen to people like me, but I would implore them to even think of their own future and make sure those skills are in place.
Great point. I think probably we're drawing to a close. Does anybody else want to make a last point, or should we give the final words to Cornelia?
Well, thanks. I was just going to come back to Wendy's point about pushing out the public. I think Clarendon Park really is the issue that so encapsulates everything that's going wrong. And the way the public was pushed out there was they put in a planning application for the scheme, which completely redefined the idea of significance in planning policy. So effectively, they cheated on the planning policy. Then they pushed it through the Guildford Borough Council in one meeting, which Calvin also came to. It never went to a planning inspector. So it's with the absolute minimum scrutiny, all stitched up. The fact that hundreds of people wrote in to object didn't make the slightest difference. The fact that 40,000 members voted against the scheme at the AGM made no difference. So it's that idea that the institution knows best and doesn't have to listen to anybody. I think that's at heart the problem. Yeah. I think it is a big problem that the National Trust is as big as it is. Of course, there are advantages too, and until not very long ago, the size of the National Trust was an unalloyed good. But it does now have a veto, really, over the future of traditional heritage crafts in this country, which is terrible. On Calvin's other point, and indeed Wendy's point about the membership, I dare say it is tremendously tempting, if you're a member of the National Trust, to shake the dust off your feet. But of course, that's how you give up your influence. Only members can vote. If they don't listen as much as they need to their own members, they definitely don't listen to non-members. So I would ask people listening, please, if you want to make a difference, keep up your membership, go to the AGM and say your stuff, make your voice heard. Don't go away, don't keep quiet.
Thank you for your time, your excellent points, and the wonderful work you're doing. I mean, it really is quite inspiring, and I know how difficult it is, but I think you've just done really, really well. Thank you for your time. And we'll leave it there. Cornelia, Calvin, Alka, Wendy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Arts First. You can subscribe for free and listen to all of our episodes at our Substack website. You'll find that at artsfirst.uk. There you'll find relevant links, images, programme notes and other resources, and of course our donations page. You don't have to sign up for access, but if you do, you'll be kept informed of new episodes and articles as they come out. You can also listen to episodes on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and on our YouTube channel. If you like what we do, enjoy our podcasts, agree with some of our concerns on freedom of expression in the arts, for example, then we'd really appreciate any support, ideas and feedback. Tell your friends, share our episodes, sing our praises on social media. But for now, many thanks and we'll see you next time.